Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e5. Knight g1 to f3. Knight b8 to c6. Bishop f1 to b5. Pawn a7 to a6. Bishop b5 takes c6. Pawn d7 takes c6. Knight b1 to c3. Bishop c8 to g4. Pawn h2 to h3. Bishop g4 takes f3. Queen d1 takes f3. Knight g8 to f6. Castle kingside. Bishop f8 to d6. Pawn d2 to d3. Castle kingside. Bishop c1 to g5. Bishop d6 to e7. Queen f3 to f5. Knight f6 to d7. Pawn h3 to h4. Queen d8 to e8. Pawn a2 to a3. Pawn c6 to c5. Knight c3 to d5. Bishop e7 to d8. Pawn a3 to a4. Pawn g7 to g6. Queen f5 to g4. Pawn c7 to c6. Bishop g5 takes d8. Rook a8 takes d8. Knight d5 to c7. Queen e8 to e7. Queen g4 to g5. Knight d7 to f6. Pawn h4 to h5. Pawn a6 to a5. Pawn h5 takes g6. Pawn h7 takes g6. Pawn f2 to f4. Rook d8 to d6. Pawn f4 takes e5. Queen e7 takes c7. Pawn e5 takes d6. Knight f6 takes e4. Pawn d6 takes c7. Knight e4 takes g5. Rook f1 to f5. Pawn g6 takes f5. Pawn d3 to d4. Pawn c5 takes d4. Rook a1 to d1. Knight g5 to a6. Pawn g2 to g4. Pawn f5 takes g4. King g1 to f2. Pawn f7 to f5. Rook d1 takes d4. Knight e6 takes d4. King f2 to a3. Knight d4 to a6. Pawn b2 to b4. Pawn a5 takes b4. Pawn c2 to c3. Pawn b4 takes c3. Pawn a4 to a5. Pawn f5 to f4, check. King e3 to e4. Pawn c3 to c2. King e4 to d3. Pawn c2 to c1, promoting to queen. Pawn a5 to a6. Queen c1 to e3, check. King d3 to c4. Queen e3 to d4, check. King c4 to b3. Queen d4 to d3, check. King b3 to b2. Queen d3 to d2, check. King b2 to b3. Queen d2 to d3, check. King b3 to b4. Pawn c6 to c5, check. King b4 to a4. Pawn b7 to b5, check. King a4 to a5. Rook f8 to c8. Pawn a6 to a7. Queen d3 to d2, check. King a5 takes b5. Queen d2 to e2, check. King b5 to c6. Rook c8 takes c7, check. King c6 to d5. Rook c7 to d7, check. King d5 to c6. Queen e2 to a6, check. King c6 takes d7. Knight e6 to f8, check. King d7 to c7. Queen a6 takes a7, check. King c7 to d6. Pawn c5 to c4. King d6 to e5. Pawn f4 to f3. King e5 to e4. Pawn f3 to f2. King e4 to f4. Queen a7 to d4, check. King f4 to g3. Pawn c4 to c3. King g3 to g2. Pawn g4 to g3. King g2 to f3. Queen d4 to d3, check. King f3 to g2. Pawn f2 to f1, promoting to queen, checkmate.